You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke McKenna, but today's case is about the bizarre Miyazawa family murders. Now, this was a family loved by all and a crime that horrified many. How was this killer so calculated and yet so careless at the same time? Many theories are going to be presented in this case, but which one will you believe? By the way, I want to give a special thanks to the Unsolved podcast that did a ton of amazing research on this case, and it's where I got a lot of my information because it is quite hard to find information on cases that are not from the United States. And so that podcast really did help me to find the correct information. But by the way, I post so much content like this. It's my absolute passion to tell these stories. I mean no harm or disrespect when I do so. So if you would like to support me in doing that, all you have to do is make sure you are subscribed, give this video a thumbs up, and leave a nice comment down below. Now let's get back to the story. Also, I want to throw in here, if I mispronounce any of these places or these names, I am deeply sorry, and I mean no disrespect by doing so. I just simply am really bad at pronouncing things, and I tried to learn as best I could, but if I mess up, please do forgive me. So it was 2000 in Tokyo, and the Miyazawa family lived in Setagaya, which was a small suburb of Tokyo. And this was the family of four. That was the father, who is 44-year-old Mikio, and his wife, who is 41-year-old Yasuko. And they had two children together, an 8-year-old daughter named Niina and a 6-year-old son named Rei. They were a really loving, healthy, good family, and they were also pretty quiet as well. They never caused any trouble between anyone in the neighborhood or co-workers or anything like that. Mikio actually worked at home for a corporate identity development for a media and marketing company, and this was a huge company that actually branded the term Wi-Fi. So his job was very well respected, and he got paid a decent amount for doing so. But since there were locations all over the world, Mikio could stay at home where he had his own basically office space in the home. But Mikio wasn't staying home or working from home because he was super introverted or because he wanted to get away from people. In fact, his coworkers said he was really nice and they loved to be around him, and he was just that kind of guy that everybody could get along with. Now, Yasuko was actually a teacher in the area, and she was so loved and well respected by her students. I mean, they all thought she was so kind and compassionate towards them, and she was also the same way towards her own kids and loved to hang out with them any of the spare time that she had. Now, Niina was a wonderful little girl who was in 2nd grade. She loved soccer and ballet and being active, and there's not really much known more than that of the kids. And it's really unfortunate because you guys know that I love to talk more about who the victims were past just being a victim. However, there's not much known besides that they were bright and brilliant children who had a future ahead of them. It was said that Rei was kind of suffering from a speech impediment that he was working towards getting better at every single day. So he was definitely a determined little boy who wanted to be the best that he could be. Now, as we all know, Tokyo is a very well populated place, and most of the developments you live in are definitely very crowded. I mean, you can't walk outside without there being tons of people. There are, next door neighbors all over the place. You can't get away from people. However, they were one of the lucky families in Tokyo because they had actually bought a house that was a little more secluded in this suburb, and they got to breathe, they got to relax, and there was actually nature around them. They lived at this house for 10 years, but it was a duplex, so it was actually a house that was split into two houses, so there was no way to get from one side of the home to the other because two different families were going to live there. However, they kind of had the best of both worlds because their neighbor was their family, and it was in fact Yasuko's mother, Ashai, who lived there, and so they knew that they wouldn't have any, arguments with their neighbors, so it was really nice to just just have her be so close to them. This was in the Soshigaya neighborhood of the Setagaya suburb. And so that meant that it was right behind the Soshigaya Park. And this was a big up-and-coming area for, you know, teenagers to go and roam, to children to play. And there was also a skate park inside, so it was also causing a bit of chaos for the families that were around this area. You know, when this had been built and when people started moving in, there was about 200 families that were living there and really thriving there. However, at this point in 2000, there were only about 4 families left. And that was because this certain park was looking to expand and everybody was having to leave their homes, but they would have wanted to anyway because of all of the pure noise and activity that was happening around. It wasn't safe for children because there were so many strangers and they couldn't just go out and play. By this time, it almost seemed to be an area where people with bad intentions were beginning to congregate, and they were able to because there was so much land and space for them to do so. And Mikio really was struggling because he was working in that area, and when you work from home you kind of need that peace and quiet to get things done, and he was having a really hard time focusing, and also they couldn't send their children outside to play. So it was just one thing after another that they were getting ready to leave this area themselves. But it was now December 31st, the end of one year and the beginning of another. And Yasuko's sister, as well as now her husband, would come and visit them for the holiday. And these two would actually stay with Ashai next door to the Miyazawa family, or the immediate family. And they would all prepare to have a lovely evening to celebrate the new year. From what I found in Japan, the holiday of New Year's is really more about family and coming together and celebrating what can come of the new year rather than just going out and getting drunk and partying like it can be in some other places. So this was very important for Yasuko's sister and her husband to be there and to be planning this get-together between the two families. Yet this family would not get to celebrate because Ashai would call over to the Miyazawas because that was a very formal way of respecting each other's privacy, is calling before you just barge on in or, you know, go knock on the door. Even though they were so close and they could do that, she had called them to just see what the plans were for that evening, to see when they should come over or what they were going to do. However, she did not get an answer, and in fact the phone didn't even ring. She would try again, and when it still didn't ring, she decided that she would need to go over next door and knock on the door to see if she could get them to answer that way. Their car was still outside, so she didn't quite understand why they weren't picking up, and maybe they were still asleep, but you'd think that the ringing alarm would wake them up. So she went and she knocked on the door, and she still would get no response. And that is when she would let herself in. As she walked in, she called out to them and she got no response once again. However, then she would come face to face with her son-in-law Mikio at the bottom of the staircase. He was already deceased. At this point, Ashai panicked and began to run up the stairs to see where the other members of the family were, if they were okay, if they needed help, and quickly she would find Niina and her own daughter Yasuko at the top of the stairs, deceased as well. And then she would go for the last member of the family, Rei. She would find him in his bedroom, in his bed, but he was dead as well. Ashai had just found her daughter, son-in-law, and grandchildren, and there was nothing she could do to help them. She ended up calling the Tokyo Police Department, and they would come and they would do the family's autopsies. You know, of course, they were shocked when they got there. This is not something that was said to happen in Japan, and they didn't quite know what to do, but they got to work immediately. And when the autopsies were done, they would be even more horrified as to what they would see, because Niina and Yasuko had been stabbed to death. But it had been an overkill of sorts because they had been stabbed even after they were deceased. Yasuko seemed to have the most stab wounds because it appeared as though she had fought back, perhaps to try to save Niina. Now at the same time, Mikio had tons of stab wounds as well, including one on his head and his neck. And it also was thought that he had been thrown or fell down the stairs. But Rei, the youngest child, he hadn't been stabbed at all. He had actually been strangled to death. It was calculated that their time of death was around 11:30 p.m. on December 30th, so the night before Ashai had found them. And oddly enough, they quickly found the murder weapon, because it was a sashimi knife that was in the kitchen, and it still had blood on it. And it was actually broken. This knife did not belong to the family, and it was also found that the girls of the family had another knife used on them as well. This was one from their own kitchen, and it was also in the kitchen with blood all over it. These murder weapons had both been left. But that isn't all that they would find in the house. What they would find next would be the most disturbing, strange part of this case, and maybe of any I've ever researched. But they wouldn't find this right off the bat. In fact, they were so preoccupied with the full investigation and all the media attention that it wasn't even something that they were looking into just yet. They had so much on their plate and a house full of murder victims, and mass homicides are apparently so rare in Japan, and this crime took everyone by complete surprise, and people everywhere in Japan were panicking that someone that could do this was running rampant. A massive manhunt would begin. However, they didn't know what to look for because the Miyazawas didn't have any enemies. So who would have done this other than a complete stranger? And if so, how would they be able to track them? Ashai, who lived right next door and should have been able to hear a lot of these things happening, said the only thing that she heard was a loud thump at around 11:30 that evening, and she didn't really think much of it because after that she heard nothing else. And investigators believed that this thump was Mikio falling or being thrown down the stairs, and they also believed that Rei had been killed first, which is why he was strangled and everybody else was stabbed. But it could also have been because he was so young. Maybe the killer didn't want to stab such a young boy. Investigators also found that Mikio had been on his computer at 10:48 p.m. that evening that they were all murdered, and this was because he had an email that was for work that was password protected that he would have had to have known the password for to get into, meaning he had to be the one to open it. So they knew he was on his computer at 10:48, and within that hour everything in the home changed. Investigators were spending countless hours trying to piece everything together because this just didn't make sense. Investigators would try to go back about a week before the murders to see if anything leading up to the murders would fill them in on how this could have happened, and they would find that Mikio had allegedly started confronting skaters and people in the park who were making too much noise and who were kind of getting in the way of his work, and he had asked them to basically be quiet and respect his privacy, and apparently he'd stood up to them, but I don't think it had escalated any further past them having a confrontation. However, some witnesses said that he had confronted members of a local gang, and of course this can get you in some serious trouble. But by Christmas, December 25th, Yasuko had begun to tell people she was seeing a vehicle parked in front of their home, and this happened several more times with the same car. And of course, because this was such a vibrant area that was so busy, people were just thinking maybe this was someone who was going to the park and needed to find some quick parking. However, there was a fence between the Miyazawa home and the park, so they would have parked there and then needed to scale the fence or go completely around, so it just wouldn't make sense that they would be parked there. A witness then came forward saying that on December 29th, 2 days before these murders, a strange man in his 40s was walking around the Miyazawa house, but they couldn't say more than he was about in his 40s, and they had no idea if this was just a man taking a walk nearby or if it was something more. That same day, on December 29th, a man in his 30s to even 40s, about 35 to 40, was seen at a train station that was only a few miles from the Miyazawa home, and he was wearing a skater outfit, which was strange for the time because it was so cold outside, and this wasn't something that had a ton of layers or was very warm. It's more for the style. He was also wearing a backpack, and people noticed him because he wasn't dressed for the weather, but it would be shown that he, or a witness would come forward saying that there was this man that looked like this at the train station. And then that same day, a man would be seen buying a sashimi knife nearby at the local shopping center, and he was said to be wearing the same outfit, so he could have been the same man, and it was the only one bought that day. Another witness would say the same man with wearing the same outfit was seen near, like closer to, the Miyazawa home the day of the murders. The next day, it was December 30th, and the family had a pretty relaxed Saturday. They went shopping around 6 p.m., and then when they got home, Niina wanted to go over to her grandmother's house, so Yasuko called Ashai and asked if Niina could come over, and she said of course. So Niina came to watch a TV program, as she often did, at the home next door, and then a few hours later she would come home and it was time for bed. However, their lives would all be brutally taken. But by who? Well, more witnesses were coming forward, more tips were flooding in, and one man said he was walking in the park, which was behind their home, around 10 p.m. when he heard what he thought was a couple arguing. It sounded like a man and a woman and just a normal couple that was having an argument, and he didn't hear more than that, so he just continued on. However, another witness said they had seen a man kind of scurrying away from the home a little while later, like he was rushing away. Tips continued to flood in, and the police had around 12,000 pieces of information. Little did they know they had one that might have been the most important. However, they wouldn't be getting to it quite yet. You see, they were working to establish what exactly happened inside the home that evening, and they believed that the killer had cut the phone lines and then climbed a tree that was in the back of the home near where the park was, where they could get to the second floor window where there was a screened window, and they had cut through and gotten through that way. And that is when it was said that the killer would have walked to Rei's room and strangled him first. And investigators then believed that Mikio had heard this struggle from where he was working downstairs, and he ran up to kind of fight off this killer, not knowing that Rei was already deceased and that the killer would get injured at this time, but he would also stab Mikio in the head, and this would be with the sashimi knife. And remember that I told you this knife was broken? Well, the missing piece would be found in Mikio's head. So investigators believed after that he was thrown, or he stumbled down the stairs where he landed, and that is when Yasuko and Niina were being attacked with this broken knife. And when that wasn't working, the killer went downstairs to find another weapon, and that is when Yasuko took the time to patch up Niina, and her blood would actually be found on a first aid kit, and this gauze and this padding would be used to try to stop the bleeding, because they either believed this killer had left or they were trying to save themselves, because if they would have tried the phones, the lines were cut. So even if they did try, they were kind of feeling helpless. However, this killer would return with a new knife from their kitchen, and he would finish the job. But I told you that is not the end of what happened that night in the home, because luckily enough, evidence was covering the entire house. because investigators believed that this killer hadn't just killed and fled. They had stayed for hours. This could have been 2 hours, this could have been 10, but they didn't leave right away. They made themselves at home, and investigators had been found that the computer had been used after Mikio had already passed away. Someone was drinking barley tea. They were eating ice cream cups, multiple of them. The killer had also left feces in the toilet of the upstairs bathroom, and they would take this in for it to be analyzed, and they would find that this killer had eaten a meal that was a sesame spinach dish before. And there were also trash piles found in the bathtub. It was like trash had just been thrown in there, and different objects as well, with no rhyme or reason or connection to them at all. Footprints could be found around the house, whether that was in blood or whether that was in dirt, and they were all from a Setagaya tennis shoe, which was a specific Korean size that was not found in Japan. Towels were also found in the family that had blood on them that was tested and did not match anyone in the family. It appeared that someone had taken a nap that night on the sofa and had also collected all of their IDs and documents and kind of organized them on the coffee table as though they were trying to find something. The computer had also been connected to the internet at around 1:18, and someone had opened a bookmark that Mikio had kind of bookmarked himself that was to a theater show that he was going to buy tickets for. And this killer tried to buy these tickets once again, but didn't go through. He also tried to access Mikio's bank account, which was why these documents were thought to be laid out, because this killer was trying to find a password, but he could not because he wasn't able to access the bank account. Now, the computer was also thought to be accessed again that next morning at 10 a.m. right before Ashai would find them all, and the killer was thought to take some money from the home. It was the equivalent of $1,000, but there was still some that was easy access that was not taken. Now, an old jacket that was like a dark color of Mikio was the only thing to be found that was also taken, but that would be because of another reason that was even more strange. But around 10 a.m. when this computer was found to be logged into once again was about the time that Ashai would come over. It's not known whether she messed with the computer accidentally or the killer fled as soon as she had opened the door and he was the one that had messed with the computer. But either way, this killer was thought to be calculated and confident because he stayed for hours without believing that they would be caught. Now, I am saying he, however, we don't know, and sometimes I just think we associate a killer with a male. However, it very well could have been a female, so excuse me for using the pronoun of he. I think it's just something we're all so used to doing, but it's something we need to kind of change. So yeah, I'll try to do that moving forward. Now, investigators had also found something huge in the home, because I told you the killer had taken Mikio's jacket, and that was because this killer seemed to leave an entire outfit behind as though they had stripped naked and walked out the door. Because they would find a pair of black pants, a black AirTech jacket, a white long sleeve shirt with purple sleeves, and a gray bucket hat, or what they call a crusher hat. It also included a pair of black Edwin gloves, a multicolor scarf without tags, and a black handkerchief that had been ironed, which was quite strange, as well as tennis shoes and an army green fanny pack looking bag that was a bit bigger than that. But inside this bag was a piece of grip tape for skateboards and pieces of sand. Now, this sand would be so important, but these clothes also kind of pointed to a skater, because this was kind of the trend of the clothing that skaters would wear at the time. Everything was found to have been washed in hard water, which means that it couldn't have been washed in Japan, but it could have been washed in Korea because they had more hard water. Now, the sand was also tested, and apparently sand is very, very specific, and you can find exactly where it comes from. Every sand is different, and so they would actually find it at the United States Air Force Base in Los Angeles that was the Edwards Air Force Base. And this just threw an entire new path in this investigation, because now they were looking at the United States as well. The undershirt that was white and purple was found to be a very rare shirt. Only 130 had been sold. However, they couldn't track even those 130 people. They could only track about 12 of them to see, you know, where they were at the time and if they had bought this shirt, and they couldn't find all of them. So it didn't really matter that only a small amount of people had purchased it, because they couldn't even find all of them. Now, the blood at the crime scene that didn't belong to the family was of course put into the databases in the Tokyo Police Department. However, none could be traced, and at this point they found that the killer's blood was type A from a male and was possibly a mixed race with maternal DNA of European descent, meaning that the mother was possibly from Europe, and a paternal DNA or father from East Asian descent. The Y chromosome had shown that it was more likely Korean or Chinese than Japanese. After finding this out, the Tokyo police did decide to reach out to the International Criminal Police Organization for some help, knowing that this killer could have been really from anywhere and could be located anywhere now. And by this time, this investigation was becoming one of the largest in Japan, and there would be 1,000 investigators on this case, and they had kind of found that their profile of the killer before had not been entirely correct, because now they believed the killer had been born between 1965 and 1985, meaning that the killer could be anywhere from 15 years old to 35 years old, because of how much physical endurance they would need to get inside the home and to kill all of these people. And so that was significantly younger than what they had originally thought. And all of these witnesses were seeing people much older than this. They also believed that this killer was around 170 centimeters or 5'7" feet tall, and of a thin build, and was also right-handed. The police would then ask the public for help, and even more tips would begin to flood in, and that is when investigators would be looking through all of these, the past ones, the present ones, and they would find a few that were quite interesting. One was that the neighborhood that the Miyazawa family lived in started to find animals that were either harmed or tortured, starting as early as that summer 2000, before the murders occurred. And they were often, you know, stray animals or rodents that were found killed, or cats that were skinned and were found with their tails cut off, and it was just horrific things to do with animals that show some sort of sadistic behavior, and nobody could really figure out why this was happening. This also would make sense with a younger killer, because if this person was starting with animals, perhaps it was the first time that they were trying to harm something. You know, we do often see in psychopaths that they do start out with animals and they move on to humans from there. And so it just kind of showed, was this someone much younger who escalated? But could they escalate that quickly, or did they start with one person at a time? Because to go from animals to an entire family is a bit extreme. Another tip that would come in was from a taxi driver who said that 3 men had wanted to be picked up around this area the night of the murders, and it was nearby the house. They were very quiet the entire journey. They were very suspicious. They were 3 middle-aged men, and when they got out, they had left blood behind on the seat. Someone had a wound. Now, it's said that this DNA on the back of the cab was tested. However, nobody knows if that's true or if it was connected or not. There was also another tip found from a train station about 3 hours away from the murder scene, and this was at a train station, and this was 6 hours after the bodies had been found, when a man would be admitted to the hospital because he had a deep stab wound in his hand, and it was exposing bone because it was so deep. Now, this man was said to be in his 30s. He didn't give up his name. He was not concerned about his wound at all. In fact, as soon as they patched him up, he just got up and left, and no one knew anything more about what had happened to him or who he was. So were all of these tips that were coming in connected? Did they have to do with the murders, or were they purely coincidence? Well, that's what the police couldn't figure out. Although investigators would have another clue 100 days after the murders, and they were going through evidence when they found that they had collected a small Buddhist statue that had been brought in at the time of the murders. It was found a few miles from the crime scene, and it was near the family home in a creek bed. Now, this certain statue was actually said to be basically to keep children safe in the afterlife when they had died before their parents. They had no idea if this was part of the case, a possible motive, or just a random object found, because Rei was killed before his parents, and of course Yasuko was killed before her mother. So could this have had anything to do with it? Why would this random statue have been thrown out? Although, because so many people were moving at this time, possibly they had lost it or it had fallen out of a moving truck. You know, you never know. Strange things are found on the side of the road all the time, but the police were trying to track anything that could have a possible lead at this point because they had nothing. No suspects at all. Now, this case is still unsolved today. We have no idea what happened. So what do you think happened? Was this because Mikio had gone and told off the skaters or possibly the members of the gang, and they murdered the entire family to get back at him? It doesn't really make sense to me. I mean, I guess the gang does, because, you know, you get on the wrong side of any member of a gang and the whole gang can come after you. We've seen it multiple times in crimes before and in murder cases. So I guess that is a possibility. However, it didn't really seem to me like a kind of a gang type of murder ritual. I mean, I don't know much about it, but it just seemed a little too careless for gang members, unless it was just young gang members who were doing it on their own rather than going with the entire gang. I guess that could be part of it too, but you know, another theory is, was this a possible co-workers of Mikio's who lived in another place but possibly didn't get a promotion and Mikio had, and it was like revenge for that because this was such a good company? But is that enough for Mikio's entire family's life to be taken? You know, I could see if this possible coworker or anyone getting revenge on Mikio could have, you know, come and killed him if the family saw, get rid of them all. But the fact that Rei was most likely killed first just doesn't make sense if it was because of Mikio. And the other theory that is really, you know, discussed is, was this one killer or was this more? Was this the three men in the taxi? Was it a joint effort? Did the person who went through the tree through the screen door break in first so he could let the other two members or many members in? Maybe these three killers went in. One killed Rei, one killed Mikio, and one killed Yasuko and Niina. And that's why kind of all of the wounds are a little bit different. And the biggest theory I have found so far is, could this killer have been from the military, possibly stationed in or near Japan, and that is why the sand connected to a military base. Maybe this soldier was doing a killing spree across the world, and that is why they couldn't catch him, because he had already fled to another country. To me, this did seem like a killer who liked to commit murders in different areas so they wouldn't be caught, and liked to move around a little bit because they couldn't be found in the Tokyo Police Department database. And the only thing is, how could this killer be so careful yet so careless at the same time? And how were they able to get away with murder? Because I think in a lot of ways the killer seems to be someone who is very well experienced in killing, and to kill an entire family before any of them got away. However, then, you know, doing all of the other things and staying in the home, just, you know, in a way it shows confidence, because the killer was like, I'm not going to get caught, I can stay here. But in another, he left so much evidence behind. But it's also careless. However, he still didn't get caught. So I don't know. I don't know if this killer is stupid or extremely brilliant. You know, were they stupid and just somehow got away with it? Or were they extremely good at what they did? And was this person stalking the home prior to doing this, or did they see the Miyazawas at the grocery store that evening and decide to follow them home and take their lives? Was it just a random spur of the moment murder? That's the thing with this case, we really don't know. And what was with the animals being harmed right before this? It really just creeped me out when I heard that. And I did read a source that said this was actually found to be a bank clerk that had nothing to do with the murders. However, I couldn't find much information on how they didn't have anything to do with the murders, how deeply they were investigated, or why he was killing animals. You know, that just, I don't know. I really think that they should have looked deeper into the bank clerk, but I don't even know if that is true, that someone was found to be doing that to the animals. Something I found strange was that all the witness statements said that this was a 30 to 40-year-old man walking around in a skater outfit who bought the knife, who was just lurking in the area. And I mean, I know that this was probably a trend at that time and in the area, but isn't it a bit odd for a middle-aged man to be dressing that way? I mean, don't get me wrong, I don't know if this was just how everyone in Japan dressed, but it seemed to me like something more for a teenager or, you know, in their 20s to be doing. So wouldn't people have noticed if this 40-year-old man showed up wearing something that looked really young? Because, you know, we can see those older adults out dressing like teenagers, and you just kind of feel weird about it. You know, even though everyone's allowed to wear what they want, I think we all do kind of see the difference in an older person wearing younger clothes. So did none of the skaters in the area realize this? Or possibly was this killer older but looked young? Or was he really young and looked older? I didn't see any statements from skaters in the area being questioned, but I do wonder if they were talked to at all, because they could have probably provided a lot of information in this case. Now with this case, I didn't find that there was any sort of police negligence. I think it was more of an experience. They didn't quite know what they were doing. Mass homicides were not even a thing, and they were just so shocked that they were doing their best, but it was already such a mysterious case that they didn't know what to do. Some of you are probably thinking about the family that lived next door, Yasuko's mother, Ashai, and you know, I hate to even talk about a grieving family and what they could have to do with it, but I think it is something investigators look into, we need to talk about. So there are some people who do believe that Ashai and her other daughter and son-in-law had something to do with it. And you know, Ashai had been questioned about everything that happened when she had found them, and she had said that when she had walked in, she had seen the ground floor light on as well as the entrance hallway, but then a paperboy came forward saying that the lights weren't on at all. She also couldn't remember if the door was locked and she had to use her spare key to get in, or if it was unlocked and she needed to just push the door open. And of course, when looking into an investigation like this, that's important, because did the killer go out the front door or not? Did the killer keep the door locked, or was it unlocked? And she just kept changing her story, and many looked at this as very suspicious. I mean, this strange behavior could be chalked up to the horror and trauma of finding your entire family in a blood-filled home and crime scene. I mean, the complete shock of that can completely cause your brain to shut down or even compartmentalize what you had just seen and kind of put it way in the back of your mind where you can't even register it anymore. You don't know what had happened. It's just kind of this black wall that you can't see. Whole memories can disappear and cause you to draw a blank, and there's no deception of this. You know, when this is happening, it's not that somebody doesn't want to tell you, it's simply that they cannot. It's something your brain does for you to cope, and this very well could have been what Ashai was doing, and she couldn't tell them what they needed to know even if she wanted to. I can't say this is what happened to Ashai, and I can't say she didn't do it. However, the police obviously would have looked into her, and they didn't believe that her or her daughter and son-in-law were suspects. So I do think it's a little strange that they heard a loud thump and didn't think to, even just call over to them to see, hey, what happened? What was that? But, even though they were family, they were said to act like normal neighbors and really only, called when they needed to and didn't just bombard them with their presence, and they gave each other the privacy they deserved. Now, it was also found that in 2015, this case was still unsolved, and a documentary about it would come out. And Yasuko's sister, who was, living next door at the time, or who was visiting and living next door, she would go to the Broadcast and Human Rights and Other Relation Rights Committee of the Broadcasting Ethics and Program Improvement Organization to file a complaint because this documentary and back to theory that basically the family was murdered out of resentment. And I couldn't find the documentary to find why this resentment was said to occur, but the family did not agree with this, and so they were very offended that they would have said this. A book was also released around this time by a true crime author named Fumio Ekihashi, and he had said that he had found a suspect. He referred to this man as R, and he believed he had traced the soil of the footprints that were found in the home to Gyeonggi in South Korea, and R had apparently served time in the Korean army, and he believed that R had killed them for money. Fumio said that this man's fingerprints matched those of the crime scene, and he also said that every family in the park that was either leaving or had already left had been given 100 million yen to leave. So they were, on good terms with money at that point. They had quite a bit. This was not confirmed or denied whether this money was actually given or whether this theory is true at all. But if this money was really given to the families, this could have put a huge target on their backs that we didn't know of before, because they were just an average family before. But if they had this new money, and if they were one of the last ones there who had received it, and possibly this killer didn't know where the rest of the families who had received it had moved, this would make a great motive. It was also theorized that the killer could have been an unemployed young man, because during Japan at this time, they were said to be in the lost decade where about 4% of the youths were unemployed, and there was a rise in the unemployment, and this could be why this killer was trying to get into the bank account and they couldn't crack the password, and that is when they were going to stay until they did, but when a shy came over they had to flee. 3 years later, in 2018, the Tokyo police released more information about this suspect, saying that they were between 15 to 20 years old, 5'7", and right-handed. They also believed that he could be a drifter or someone who moves often, in different areas, and they also said that because he was so young, he could be the son of a famous diplomat, a soldier, the son of a soldier, or the son of a local wealthy family. They were now believing that he was quite a bit younger than what they had originally thought, which kind of, throws a wrench in the whole investigation, because all the witnesses from back then were thinking of people in their 30s to 40s and who they saw at that age, and not teenagers they had seen running around. Still, no one knows what happened that night, and officers are still working this case, trying to find a killer, and a reward of 20 million yen has been offered for information, and their house that they were murdered in is now abandoned, and the city actually wanted to demolish it, and the family refused to let that happen, which, I can completely understand. It's the last, bit of the family they have left. But this case is just so bizarre and confusing, and I wanted to bring it to you because, of course, I do still love to do unsolved cases, and I think it's so heartbreaking that literally an entire family could be taken overnight and nobody could know how. I do tend to think it was someone who had a way of manipulating people into thinking they were someone that they weren't, which it does make me think maybe they were the reason for the animals being harmed, and maybe they were a teen. And even though maybe it was, you know, what we were thinking about the gangs or the gang members, but maybe it was young gang members who were proving that they could handle something like that to the bigger overall gang. You know, I'm sure that that kind of stuff happens, and it just makes me wonder. I'd really love to hear your theories on this one, because it's one that I can't even wrap my head around at all. But the Miyazawa family and who they were beyond this is what deserves to be spread, and their story needs to be heard, because it's been 20 years now and still nobody knows what happened. So yeah, I hope you were all doing so wonderful. You were staying safe, you were staying inside. There are plenty of my videos, or anybody else's videos, for you to watch in order to get you through this rough time, and I hope that these videos do help, because I will continue posting as long as you guys want me to, and as long as I have internet access. So yeah, don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.